The concrete floor was cold, the chain-link walls were locked from the outside, and Sarah Mitchell, 8 months pregnant, realized she was sleeping in a dog kennel tonight, not because she committed a crime, not because she was dangerous, but because she asked her husband one simple question. Where did $47,000 go? What Sarah did not know, what her husband Marcus never wanted her to discover, was that she was not the orphan she believed herself to be. Hidden in a safety deposit box across town was a birth certificate, a letter, and proof that Sarah was the secret daughter of a billionaire. Marcus knew. He had always known. And he married her specifically to steal an inheritance she did not even know existed. For 3 years, he isolated her, controlled her money, erased her friends, convinced the world she was mentally unstable. But Marcus made one mistake. He underestimated how far a mother will go to protect her unborn child. Tonight, we tell you the full story of Sarah Mitchell, the dog shed, the betrayal, the psychiatric facility where they tried to lock her away forever. And the moment she discovered that the blood running through her veins was worth $40 million. This is not just a story about abuse. This is a story about a woman who was buried alive and clawed her way back to the surface. A woman who turned her pain into power and her silence into a roar. Stay with me until the end, because what happens in that courtroom will leave you speechless. Value statement plus story meaning. Before we begin, here is what this story will teach you. The most dangerous prison is not made of bars. It is made of isolation, financial control, and the slow erosion of your belief in yourself. Sarah's story shows us that abusers do not always leave bruises. Sometimes they leave paperwork. Sometimes they leave lies so carefully constructed that even the victim stops trusting her own mind. But this story also teaches us something else, something more important. You can survive what was meant to destroy you. You can rebuild what was taken from you. And the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, has a way of rising to the surface. If you are watching this and something feels familiar, if someone in your life makes you question your own reality, this story is for you. You are not crazy, you are not alone, and there is a way out. The concrete floor of the dog kennel was still warm from the afternoon sun, but by midnight, it would drop below 50 degrees. Sarah Mitchell pressed her hand against her swollen belly, 8 months pregnant, and watched her husband lock the chain-link gate from the outside. Maybe tomorrow, you'll remember who pays the bills, Marcus said. Then he walked back into their $2.3 million house in Scottsdale, Arizona, and turned off the porch light. Sarah stood in the darkness, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The kennel was large, built for their 2 German shepherds, Duke and Baron. It had a concrete pad, chain-link walls, and a small covered area with old blankets the dogs used for bedding. The dogs themselves had been moved inside the house an hour ago. She had been moved out. Her crime was simple. She had asked Marcus why $47,000 had been transferred to an account she did not recognize. Through the kitchen window, she could see him now, making himself a sandwich. He moved casually, as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if locking your pregnant wife in a dog kennel was just another Tuesday evening. Duke appeared at the back door, pawing at the glass. He looked at Sarah through the darkness, then at Marcus, then back at Sarah. His confusion was almost comical. Even the dog knew something was wrong. Even the dog understood that humans belonged inside and animals belonged outside, not the other way around. Sarah lowered herself carefully onto the pile of old blankets, her back aching, her ankles swollen. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if protesting the accommodations. She whispered to her belly, "I know, sweetheart, I know." She had been married to Marcus Mitchell for almost 4 years. In that time, She had watched him transform from the charming man who pursued her with flowers and promises into something she barely recognized. The change had been gradual, like watching paint fade in the sun. You never noticed it happening until one day you looked up and realized everything had changed. But this was something else entirely. Sarah pulled her knees up as far as her pregnant belly would allow and wrapped her arms around herself. The Arizona desert cooled rapidly after sunset, and she was wearing only a thin cotton dress. Marcus had not allowed her time to grab a jacket. He had not allowed her time to grab anything. She thought about screaming. The neighbors were not far, but the Mitchell property sat on 2 acres, and the kennel was positioned behind the main house, shielded from the street by landscaping that Marcus had insisted upon for privacy. No one would hear her, and even if they did, what would she say? My husband locked me outside because I asked about money. She could already hear the responses. Marriage is complicated. He must have had a reason. Are you sure you are remembering correctly? That last question haunted her more than any other, because Marcus had been asking her that same question for months now. Years, if she was honest. Are you sure? Do you really remember it that way? I never said that. You must be confused. She had started to wonder if maybe she was confused. Maybe she did misremember things. Maybe the problem was her. But she had not misremembered $47,000. She had found the transfer 3 weeks ago while paying bills online. Marcus usually handled the finances, but he had been traveling for work, and the electric bill was overdue. She had logged into their joint account and seen the transaction immediately. $47,000, transferred to an account she had never seen before, with no description, no explanation. She had not confronted him immediately. Something had stopped her, some instinct she could not name. Instead, she had started paying attention. She had photographed bank statements at 2 in the morning when Marcus was asleep. She had created a secret email account to store evidence. She had researched divorce attorneys in the Phoenix area. That was when she discovered that Marcus had already consulted with the top 5 family law firms in the city. All of them, which meant none of them could represent her without a conflict of interest. He had been planning this, planning something, she just did not know what. Tonight she had finally asked him about the money. She had done it carefully, casually, while making dinner. She had practiced the question in her head a dozen times, making sure her voice would not shake. Hey, I noticed a transfer from our account. $47,000 to somewhere I did not recognize. What was that for? Marcus had stopped chewing. He had set down his fork with deliberate precision, and then he had smiled. You have been snooping, he said. Sarah's heart had dropped into her stomach. I was paying the electric bill. It was right there in the transaction history. No, Marcus said, still smiling. You have been doing more than that. He pulled out his phone and showed her screenshots. Her 2 a.m. photo sessions, her secret email account, her browser history showing searches for divorce attorneys and women's shelters and how to leave an abusive marriage. He had spyware on her phone. He had known everything she was doing. He had been watching her try to escape while she thought she was being clever. You think you are smart? Marcus asked. Let me show you what smart looks like. He made 3 phone calls in front of her while she stood frozen in the kitchen. The first was to their bank. He removed her access to all accounts, effective immediately. The second was to his attorney. Start the paperwork, he said. We discussed this. The third was to Diane Morrison, Sarah's only real friend. Diane, it is Marcus. I need to tell you something difficult. Sarah has been having a mental health crisis. She has been paranoid, delusional. I am getting her help, but please do not contact her for a while. It only makes things worse when people feed into her delusions. Sarah had watched her entire support system disappear in 90 seconds. "Since you want to act like a bitch," Marcus said, pocketing his phone, "you can sleep with them." He grabbed her arm and marched her out the back door. She was too shocked to resist, too pregnant to fight, too confused to understand that this moment would change everything. He locked the kennel gate and walked away without looking back. That was 3 hours ago. Now Sarah sat in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and the closer sounds of crickets. Her phone was inside the house. Her purse was inside the house. Everything she owned, everything she needed, was inside the house with the man who had just locked her outside like an animal. She placed both hands on her belly and felt her daughter move. "I am going to get us out of this," she whispered. "I do not know how yet, but I am going to figure it out." The baby kicked in response. Sarah chose to interpret that as agreement. She leaned her head back against the chain-link fence and stared up at the stars. Somewhere out there, she had to believe, there was a version of her life that did not look like this. A version where she was safe. A version where her daughter would never know what it felt like to be trapped. She just had to survive long enough to find it. To understand how Sarah Mitchell ended up in a dog kennel at 32 years old, you had to understand the woman she was before Marcus found her. She grew up in rural Montana, raised by a woman named Eleanor Walsh, who worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families in Bozeman. Eleanor was not Sarah's biological mother, a fact Sarah had always known. But Eleanor was the only mother she had ever needed. "Your birth parents could not keep you safe," Eleanor had explained, when Sarah was old enough to ask questions. "So I did. That is all you need to know for now." Eleanor was not warm in the traditional sense. She did not offer easy affection or soothing words, but she was steady. She was present. She worked double shifts so Sarah could have new shoes for school. She sat up all night when Sarah had the flu, pressing cool cloths to her forehead. She taught Sarah to cook, to sew, to balance a checkbook, to never rely on anyone for money. "You take care of yourself," Eleanor said often. "You hear me? No matter what else happens in your life, you make sure you can take care of yourself." Sarah heard her. She listened. She got scholarships to the University of Montana, worked her way through college, graduated with a marketing degree, and a determination to build a life that was entirely her own. Then Eleanor got sick. Cancer. The aggressive kind that does not negotiate. Sarah moved back to Montana for the final 8 months. She held Eleanor's hand through chemotherapy. She cleaned up after the bad days. She pretended not to see the fear in Eleanor's eyes when the doctors stopped talking about treatment and started talking about comfort. 2 weeks before she died, Eleanor called Sarah to her bedside. "There is a safety deposit box," Eleanor said, her voice thin as paper. "First National Bank in Phoenix, box 447. The key is in my jewelry box, inside the ceramic cat, on my dresser." Sarah nodded, confused. "What is in the box?" "The truth," Eleanor said, "about who you are, about where you come from." Sarah's heart began to race. "Tell me now, please." But Eleanor shook her head. "Not yet. When you are ready, when you are strong enough to handle it. Promise me, Sarah. Promise me you will not open that box until you are truly ready." "How will I know when I am ready?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "You will know. And when you do, when you finally learn the truth, I need you to understand something. Everything I did to protect you. Everything," Sarah promised. She did not understand, but she promised. Eleanor died 11 days later. Sarah buried her in a small cemetery outside Bozeman, next to a grave marker for Eleanor's late husband, a man Sarah had never met. Then she packed up the small house, put Eleanor's belongings in a storage unit, and moved to Phoenix for a fresh start. She did not open the safety deposit box. She was not ready. She did not feel strong. She felt broken and alone and terrified of a future that no longer had Eleanor in it. That was when she met Marcus Mitchell. He found her at a coffee shop 6 months after Eleanor's death. Sarah was sitting alone, reading a book, trying to remember what normal life felt like. Marcus approached with confidence and charm, asking about her book, complimenting her smile, making her laugh for the first time in months. He was handsome, successful, a real estate developer, with an easy manner and an expensive watch. He pursued her aggressively, the kind of pursuit that felt flattering rather than alarming. Flowers delivered to her office, weekend trips to Sedona, promises of a future that sparkled with possibility. On their first date, he asked about her family. "It is just me," Sarah said. "The woman who raised me passed away recently. I do not have anyone else." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. At the time, Sarah thought it was sympathy. Later, she would recognize it for what it was: opportunity. "So, it is just you?" he said. "No one to answer to?" Sarah laughed. "I guess so." "That sounds nice," Marcus said. "That sounds free." They were engaged 4 months later. Marcus insisted on no prenuptial agreement. "I trust you completely," he said. "Money should never come between us." Sarah thought it was romantic. She did not realize that without a prenup, Arizona's community property laws gave Marcus significant control over joint assets. She did not realize that she had no separate assets to protect. She did not realize that she was walking into a trap that had been set before she even knew the trapper existed. The first year was good, or good enough. Marcus was attentive, generous, present. He suggested she quit her marketing job. "Why work?" he said. "I make enough. Stay home. Relax. You deserve it." Sarah had always worked, but she was tired, grieving. The idea of not having to perform professionally while she processed Eleanor's death felt like a gift. The second year, their joint accounts became his accounts. "For simplicity," he explained. "Tax purposes. I handle the money. You handle the home." The third year, her name disappeared from the house deed. "Estate planning," Marcus said. "My accountant recommended it. Do not worry about the details." Sarah worried, but every time she raised a concern, Marcus had an explanation. And every time she pushed back, he made her feel foolish for questioning him. "You do not understand business," he would say. "You are emotional. You are paranoid. This is why I handle these things." She started to believe him. Then she got pregnant. Sarah expected joy. She expected Marcus to be excited about becoming a father. Instead, she saw something close to panic flash across his face before he masked it with a smile. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I took 3 tests. Well," he paused, "I guess we are doing this." From that moment, everything accelerated. Marcus began monitoring her movements. He questioned her phone calls. He criticized her spending, even though he controlled all the money. He isolated her from the few friends she had made in Phoenix, finding reasons why each one was a bad influence. "Diane is filling your head with feminist nonsense," he said. "Those women from your book club are jealous of what we have. You do not need them. You have me." Sarah retreated into herself. She moved carefully, spoke less, apologized, even when she had done nothing wrong. She told herself it was pregnancy hormones making her sensitive. She told herself every marriage had rough patches. She told herself that once the baby arrived, things would improve. She did not tell herself the truth, that she was being systematically stripped of everything that made her independent, everything that would allow her to leave. Then she found the $47,000 transfer, and everything she had been pretending not to see became impossible to ignore. Sarah spent 4 hours in that dog kennel, before she remembered the phone. Her old phone, the one Marcus thought she had thrown away 6 months ago when he insisted she upgrade to a device he had set up for her. A device he controlled. A device that reported her every move back to him. But Sarah had not thrown the old phone away. She had hidden it in a shoebox in the garage, tucked behind Christmas decorations they never used. A small act of rebellion, a tiny piece of herself she refused to surrender. The kennel gate had a rust spot near the bottom hinge. Sarah had noticed it weeks ago when she was out here playing with the dogs. She had meant to tell Marcus about it, to get it repaired. Now she was grateful she had forgotten. She worked at the rust for 3 hours, scraping and pulling and twisting until her fingers bled. The metal was old, weakened by Arizona's monsoon seasons. By 4 in the morning, she had created a gap just large enough to squeeze through if she turned sideways and held her breath. The baby protested the compression with a series of sharp kicks. Sarah whispered apologies as she pulled herself through, gasping as the metal scraped against her belly. For a terrifying moment, she was stuck, the chain link pressing against her from both sides. Then something gave way, and she tumbled onto the dry grass of the backyard. She lay there for a moment, breathing hard, staring up at the stars. She was out. She was free. Now she just had to stay that way. The garage was unlocked. Marcus never bothered to secure it because there was nothing valuable inside, just tools and holiday decorations and things he considered beneath his attention. Sarah found the shoebox exactly where she had left it, behind a plastic Christmas tree they had never assembled. The phone was dead. Of course it was. It had been sitting unused for 6 months. But the charger was in the box too. Sarah plugged it into an outlet behind the workbench and watched the screen flicker to life. 12% battery. It would have to be enough. She dialed 911. 911? What is your emergency? Sarah's voice cracked. My husband. He locked me outside. I am pregnant. I need help. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Ma'am, can you tell me your location? Sarah gave the address. She explained about the kennel, about the gate, about being 8 months pregnant. The dispatcher assured her that officers were on the way. 20 minutes, maybe less. Sarah ended the call and felt relief wash over her like warm water. It was over. The police would come. They would see what Marcus had done. They would help her. She was wrong. The police arrived in 18 minutes. 2 officers, 1 male and 1 female, their flashlights cutting through the early morning darkness. Sarah met them at the side gate, still in her thin cotton dress, her fingers still bleeding from the rust. Ma'am, are you Sarah Mitchell? Yes, please. My husband locked me in the dog kennel. She pointed toward the backyard. I was out there for hours. I am pregnant. I was afraid something would happen to the baby. The female officer's expression softened. Can you show us? Sarah led them to the kennel, showed them the blankets she had been sitting on, the rust she had exploited to escape, the padlock that still hung from the gate. The officers took notes. They asked questions. They seemed to believe her. Then Marcus came outside. He was wearing a bathrobe and slippers, his hair slightly mussed, his expression one of deep concern rather than anger. He looked like a worried husband roused from sleep, not a man who had locked his pregnant wife in a cage. Thank God, he said, rushing toward Sarah. I have been looking everywhere for you. I woke up, and you were gone. I thought something had happened. Sarah stared at him. You locked me outside. Marcus's brow furrowed with convincing confusion. Honey, we talked about this. You said you wanted some air. You said the house felt suffocating. He turned to the officers with a helpless shrug. She has been having episodes lately. The pregnancy has been difficult. Her hormones are completely out of balance. That is not true, Sarah said, her voice rising. He dragged me out here. He locked the gate. I would never do that. Marcus's voice was gentle, soothing. The voice of a man dealing with someone he loved who was not in her right mind. Officers, can I speak with you privately for a moment? There are some things you should know. They stepped away, out of Sarah's hearing. She watched Marcus pull out his phone, showing them something on the screen. She watched the officer's body language change, their shoulders relaxing, their suspicion fading. When they returned, the female officer's sympathy had been replaced by something closer to pity. Ma'am, is it possible you are misremembering what happened? Your husband says you have been struggling with anxiety and paranoia. He has documentation. Documentation? Sarah's voice cracked. What documentation? Marcus stepped forward, his hand touching her elbow gently, possessively. I have been keeping records for her doctor, he explained. The episodes have been getting worse. I should have gotten her help sooner. That is my fault. I am not having episodes, Sarah said. He locked me outside. Look at the gate. Look at the padlock. The male officer cleared his throat. The gate is locked, ma'am, but there is no way to prove who locked it or why. Your husband says you sometimes lock yourself out when you are disoriented. That is insane, Sarah. Marcus's voice carried a warning only she could hear. Let us not make this worse. The female officer shifted uncomfortably. Sir, maybe you should keep a closer eye on her, given her condition. Of course, Marcus said. I will make sure she sees her doctor tomorrow. They were leaving. The police were actually leaving. Wait, Sarah said desperately. Please, you do not understand. He controls everything. He took all my money. He has spyware on my phone. He has been planning this for months. The officers exchanged a look. The look of people who had made up their minds and did not want to be bothered with contradicting evidence. Ma'am, the male officer said, marital disputes are complicated. If you feel unsafe, there are resources available to you. But based on what we have seen tonight, there is no evidence of a crime. They left. Sarah stood in the driveway, watching their taillights disappear down the street. Marcus stood beside her, his hand still on her elbow, his grip tightening as the darkness swallowed the last trace of her rescue. See what happens when you try to be clever? He whispered. Sarah did not respond. There were no words for what she felt. The despair was absolute, a black hole that had opened in her chest and was swallowing everything. She had called for help. Help had come, and help had looked at her with pity, believed her husband's lies, and driven away. Marcus steered her back toward the house. His grip was firm, but not painful. Not painful enough to leave marks. He was always careful about marks. You're going to get some sleep, he said. And tomorrow we are going to discuss what comes next. Sarah climbed the stairs to their bedroom like a woman walking to her execution. She lay down on the bed she had shared with her husband for 4 years and stared at the ceiling until sunrise. She had tried to escape. She had failed. But somewhere in the wreckage of that night, something had shifted. Not hope, not yet, but something harder. Something that would not be so easily extinguished. She pressed her hand against her belly and felt her daughter kick. I will not stop trying, she whispered. I promise you, I will never stop trying. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in control. Marcus did not lock Sarah in the kennel again. He did not need to. The threat was enough. Every time she hesitated before answering a question, every time she glanced toward the back door, he would smile and say, The dogs miss you out there. Maybe you should visit them tonight. He took her to a doctor, not a regular obstetrician, but a colleague of his, a man named Dr. Patterson, who asked leading questions and nodded sympathetically when Marcus described Sarah's episodes of confusion and paranoia. Pregnancy can trigger all sorts of psychological changes, Dr. Patterson said, not looking at Sarah directly. It is nothing to be ashamed of. I am not having psychological changes, Sarah said flatly. My husband locked me in a dog kennel. Dr. Patterson and Marcus exchanged a look, the look of men dealing with a hysterical woman. See what I mean? Marcus said sadly. She keeps fixating on this delusion. Sarah understood then that this appointment was not about helping her. It was about building a paper trail. Every note Dr. Patterson wrote would support Marcus's narrative. Every concern she raised would be documented as evidence of her instability. She stopped talking. Silence became her only weapon. At her regular OB appointment, Marcus accompanied her into the examination room. He had never done this before. He held her hand throughout the exam, answering questions for her, laughing with the doctor about how anxious first-time mothers could be. When Sarah tried to speak privately with the nurse, Marcus tightened his grip on her fingers. "She has been so anxious lately," he said. "I do not like leaving her alone. I hope you understand." The nurse nodded sympathetically. "Of course. You are such a supportive husband." Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to grab the nurse by the shoulders and shake her until she understood. But she knew how it would look. She knew what Marcus would say afterward. She stayed silent. That evening, Marcus presented her with documents, not divorce papers, as she had expected. Something worse. Psychiatric evaluation consent forms. "Sign these," he said, sliding them across the kitchen table, voluntarily. Sarah stared at the papers. "What happens if I do not?" "Then I get a court order." Marcus's voice was pleasant, reasonable. "And if I get a court order, I will make sure you never see this baby. Unfit mother, psychiatric hold, emergency custody to the father. It is all very straightforward." "You planned this?" Sarah said. "All of it. From the beginning." "Sign the papers, Sarah." Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen, but she signed, because the alternative was worse. Because he had left her no other choice. The next morning, she managed to slip away to a gas station bathroom while Marcus filled the tank. She had memorized Diane's phone number, the only friend Marcus had not completely succeeded in driving away. Diane answered on the third ring. "Sarah? Oh my God, are you okay? Marcus said you were having some kind of breakdown." "Diane, listen to me." Sarah's voice was urgent, desperate. "He is lying. Everything he told you is a lie. I need help. I need someone to believe me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Too long. "Sarah," Diane said slowly, "Marcus told me you would say something like this. He said the paranoia was getting worse. He said you have been accusing everyone of conspiring against you." "That is not true. Please, Diane. You know me." "I thought I did." Diane's voice hardened. "But the woman I knew would not leave her husband in the middle of the night and end up in a dog kennel. The woman I knew would not make up these crazy stories about spyware and stolen money." "I am not making anything up. Sarah, you need help. Professional help. Please do not call me again until you are better." The line went dead. Sarah stood in that dirty gas station bathroom, 7 months pregnant, with no money, no support, and a husband who had convinced the world she was insane. She looked at her reflection in the spotted mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. For the first time, a terrible thought crossed her mind. Maybe he is right. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe all of this is in my head. She had no evidence to the contrary. Every person she turned to believed Marcus. Every institution she approached treated her like a mental patient. Every attempt to escape had been anticipated and neutralized. What if she really was losing her mind? The baby kicked sharply, almost painfully, as if protesting the thought. "Okay," Sarah whispered to her belly. "Okay, you are right. I know what happened. I know what is real." But believing herself was getting harder every day. Marcus was waiting by the car when she emerged. He smiled his pleasant smile. "Ready to go?" Sarah nodded. She climbed into the passenger seat. She folded her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead. And she started planning, because even if she was losing this battle, she was not going to stop fighting. Even if everyone believed Marcus's lies, she was going to find someone who did not. Even if it killed her, she just had to survive long enough to find them. The psychiatric facility was nicer than Sarah expected. It looked more like a luxury spa than a mental institution. All soft colors and comfortable furniture, and staff members who spoke in soothing voices. Marcus had chosen well. This was the kind of place where wealthy families sent troublesome relatives to be quietly managed. The kind of place that prioritized discretion over truth. Sarah sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped over her pregnant belly, watching other patients drift past like ghosts. Some wore hospital gowns. Others were dressed normally, like her. All of them had the same hollow look in their eyes, the look of people who had stopped expecting anyone to believe them. She wondered if she would look like that soon. "Excuse me." Sarah looked up. An older woman had taken the seat beside her, moving with the careful grace of someone who had once been beautiful and still carried traces of it. She was perhaps 65, with silver hair styled elegantly and clothes that were expensive without being flashy. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "That is a beautiful necklace," the woman said, nodding towards Sarah's throat. Sarah's hand went automatically to the locket she wore. It was simple silver, tarnished with age, the only piece of jewelry she had refused to let Marcus take from her. Eleanor had given it to her on her 16th birthday. "Thank you," Sarah said. "It was my mother's, the woman who raised me. Antique?" "I think so." She said it was the only thing my birth family left behind. The woman's expression flickered, something moving behind her eyes, too quickly to identify. "Birth family? You were adopted?" "Raised by a woman who is not my mother," Sarah said. "But she was the best mother I could have asked for." "I see." The woman paused, her gaze fixed on the locket. "May I ask her name? The woman who raised you?" "Eleanor Walsh. She passed away a few years ago." The older woman went very still. For a long moment, she did not move, did not speak, did not even seem to breathe. Then she stood abruptly. "Excuse me," she said. "I need to make a phone call." Sarah watched her walk away, disappearing through a door marked private. Strange encounter, but everything felt strange these days. She had stopped trying to make sense of the world. 15 minutes later, a nurse called her name. The psychiatrist was a woman named Dr. Williams, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She asked Sarah to describe what had happened. The kennel, the isolation, the control, the $47,000 that started everything. Sarah told her the truth, all of it, calmly, precisely, without tears or hysteria. She had practiced this in her head 100 times, knowing that emotion would be used against her. Dr. Williams listened carefully. She took notes. She nodded. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said finally, "I see no evidence of psychiatric illness. Your account is consistent and coherent. I am not recommending commitment." Sarah's heart soared. Finally, after weeks of no one believing her, someone had listened. Someone had heard the truth. "I will document this and provide a report," Dr. Williams continued. "You are free to leave." Free. The word tasted like oxygen after drowning. Sarah stood on shaking legs and walked out of Dr. Williams' office into the waiting room. Marcus was there, smiling. Beside him stood a man in a white coat, tall and distinguished, with the air of someone accustomed to authority. "Mrs. Mitchell," the man said, "I am Dr. Harrison, Chief of Psychiatry here. I have reviewed your case and overruled Dr. Williams' assessment." The floor dropped out from under Sarah's feet. "What? Given the severity of your delusions and the risk to your unborn child, I am recommending a 72-hour hold for observation. No. Sarah backed away. Dr. Williams just said I was fine. She said there was no evidence of mental illness. Dr. Williams is relatively junior, Dr. Harrison said smoothly. I have more experience with cases like yours. Marcus stepped forward, his face arranged in concerned husband mode. Honey, this is for your own good, for the baby's good. Sarah looked at Dr. Harrison, at Marcus, at the orderlies who had materialized on either side of her. You know him, she said to Dr. Harrison. You know my husband. Neither man answered. But Marcus's smile widened just slightly. Take her to room 417, Dr. Harrison said. Sarah did not struggle as they led her away. Struggling would only confirm their story. She walked between the orderlies with her chin raised and her hands steady, even as everything inside her collapsed. She had been so close to freedom, and it had been ripped away by a man Marcus had bought, a doctor who had sold his integrity for whatever Marcus had offered. The room was small and clinical, with a bed bolted to the floor and a window that did not open. They left her there alone, locking the door behind them. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands against her belly. Her daughter was moving restlessly, kicking and turning as if she too sensed the cage closing around them. I know, Sarah whispered. I know. She understood now the full scope of her husband's plan. Get her committed, document her mental instability, take emergency custody of the baby the moment it was born, divorce her while she was incapacitated. He was going to steal her child, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. The woman from the waiting room was named Margaret Hartwell. She had not been at the psychiatric facility as a patient, but as a visitor, checking on an old friend who had struggled with depression after losing his wife. It was supposed to be a brief visit, a kindness. Nothing more. Then she saw the locket. Now Margaret sat in the private office of her attorney, her hands trembling around a cup of tea she had not touched. Are you certain? She asked. The man across from her, James Reeves, former FBI agent, turned private investigator, nodded grimly. I am certain, Mrs. Hartwell. Eleanor Walsh raised a girl named Sarah. She moved frequently, always staying off the grid. She told Sarah she was an orphan. She was protecting her from Vincent. Yes, your first husband died in prison 15 years ago, but he had a brother, Robert Crawford. That brother had a son. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Who? The son changed his name after his father's business collapsed. He goes by Marcus Mitchell now. For a long moment, Margaret could not speak. The horror of it was too vast, too calculated. Marcus Mitchell, the man who had locked that pregnant woman in a dog kennel. The man who was trying to have her committed, her cousin by blood, her daughter by blood. He knew, Margaret said slowly. He knew who Sarah was before he ever met her. Yes. The $47,000 transfer your investigators flagged, payment to a genealogist who helped him confirm Sarah's identity. Reeves slid a folder across the desk. He married Sarah to gain control of the Hartwell Family Trust. $40 million held in her name, accessible on her 35th birthday, or upon proof of identity. She does not even know it exists. Margaret thought of her first husband, Vincent Crawford, violent, controlling, a man who had threatened to kill their newborn daughter when Margaret tried to leave him. She thought of Eleanor Walsh, her housekeeper, the only person she had trusted enough to help her escape. She thought of the fire that had supposedly killed her baby, the fire that had sent her into years of grief and guilt. But there had been no body. There had never been a body. Eleanor saved her, Margaret whispered. She took my daughter, and she kept her safe for 32 years. And she kept your secret, Reeves said. Sarah grew up believing she was an orphan. Eleanor never told her the truth. Margaret understood why. She wished she did not, but she did. Vincent had connections everywhere. His brother Robert had continued his legacy of cruelty and corruption. Telling Sarah who she really was would have put her in danger. Silence had been protection. But now Vincent was dead. Robert was dead. And the only remaining threat was Marcus, the son who had inherited his father's ruthlessness without his restraint. Margaret set down her untouched tea. Where is Sarah now? Still at the facility. They are holding her on a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation. Marcus is planning to extend it indefinitely. Can we stop him? Reeves smiled, and there was nothing pleasant about it. Mrs. Hartwell, I have been investigating powerful men for 30 years. This one left a trail a mile wide, bank records showing suspicious payments, connections to corrupt medical professionals, evidence of financial abuse and coercive control. He leaned forward. If you want to stop him, we stop him. Today. Margaret stood. She had spent decades building Hartwell Industries alongside her second husband, William. She had managed billions of dollars, employed thousands of people, navigated corporate warfare and hostile takeovers. She had learned to fight in ways Vincent Crawford never could have imagined. Now she was going to use everything she had learned to save her daughter. Make the calls, she said. I want attorneys, a state medical board investigator, and law enforcement ready to move within the hour. Reeves nodded and reached for his phone. Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the Phoenix skyline. Somewhere in this city, her daughter was trapped in a locked room, believing no one was coming for her. She was wrong. Sarah had been in the psychiatric facility for 47 hours when everything changed. She had spent those hours carefully, not fighting, not making accusations, befriending a night shift nurse named Rosa Martinez, who seemed kinder than the others, requesting a patient advocate, a right she remembered from a podcast she had listened to months ago, building alliances wherever she could find them. She also smuggled out a letter. The letter went to Lisa Thompson, a former coworker Sarah had not spoken to in 2 years, someone Marcus did not know about, someone he had never thought to neutralize. The letter explained everything, and it included one crucial instruction. Go to First National Bank in Phoenix. Safety deposit box 447. The key is in a ceramic cat at my storage unit. Sarah had never opened that box herself. Eleanor had made her promise to wait until she was ready. But she was ready now. Whatever truth was in that box, it could not be worse than the lies surrounding her. Rosa had passed the letter to her sister, who mailed it from a different zip code. Now all Sarah could do was wait and hope that Lisa cared enough to help, that the box contained something useful, that any of this mattered. On the morning of her 3rd day, Marcus visited. He sat in the chair across from her bed, legs crossed, completely at ease. The man who had locked her in a dog kennel looked as relaxed as if they were having brunch. Dr. Harrison says you might need a longer stay, he said. 6 months, maybe a year, but do not worry. I will take good care of our baby. Sarah felt the old despair rising, but she pushed it down. Something had changed in her over the past 47 hours. The fighter Eleanor had raised was waking up. You will not get away with this, she said. Marcus laughed. I already have. Who is going to stop me? You? He leaned forward. Face it, Sarah. You are alone. No one believes you. No one is coming to save you. Sarah said nothing, but for the first time she smiled. Marcus frowned. What is so funny? Nothing, Sarah said. I am just starting to remember who I am. He did not understand. He would soon. 3 hours later, the facility's front doors opened, and Margaret Hartwell walked through them. She was accompanied by 3 attorneys from Caldwell and Associates, a state medical board investigator, private investigator James Reeves, and two uniformed police officers. They moved through the lobby like a force of nature, credentials flashing, voices calm but unyielding. "I am here to see Sarah Mitchell," Margaret announced. Immediately. The receptionist scrambled for the phone. 5 minutes later, the facility director appeared, his face pale with confusion and alarm. 5 minutes after that, Marcus arrived, summoned by a panicked text. He was still smiling when he walked into the conference room. He stopped smiling when he saw Margaret. "Who are you?" he demanded. "My name is Margaret Hartwell," she said calmly, "and I believe you have something that belongs to me." The door opened again, and orderlies escorted Sarah into the room. She looked tired, thinner than she should have been, but her eyes were clear and focused. She saw Margaret and froze. The woman from the waiting room. "Hello, Sarah." Margaret's voice broke slightly. "I am your mother, your real mother." The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah stared at Margaret, her mind refusing to process the words. Marcus's face went white. "This is ridiculous," he said quickly. "This is part of her delusion. She is mentally unstable." James Reeves stepped forward and dropped a folder on the conference table. Documents spilled out: birth certificates, DNA analysis, bank records, genealogical reports. "Mr. Mitchell," Reeves said, "or should I say Mr. Crawford, would you like to explain why you paid $47,000 to trace your wife's bloodline? Or why you married your first cousin without disclosing the relationship? Or why you have been trying to commit her to steal her inheritance?" Marcus's mouth opened and closed. For the first time since Sarah had known him, he had no clever response ready. "There is $40 million in a trust with Sarah's name on it," Reeves continued. "Money from the Hartwell family that she has never known about. Money you plan to control by keeping her locked away." "That is not true," Marcus said, but his voice had lost its confidence. The medical board investigator spoke up. "Doctor, Harrison's license is under review. We have evidence of financial relationships between him and Mr. Mitchell that constitute significant conflicts of interest. This facility's handling of Mrs. Mitchell's case is being investigated." Margaret turned to the police officers. "I believe you have the arrest warrant." Marcus tried to run. He made it 3 steps before the officers caught him. He struggled, cursing, threatening, promising retribution. None of it mattered. Sarah watched her husband being handcuffed. The man who had locked her in a dog kennel. The man who had tried to steal her child. The man who had almost convinced her she was insane. He looked at her with pure hatred. "You do not deserve any of this." Sarah stood up straight, one hand on her belly, her chin raised. "You are right," she said. "I did not deserve what you did to me, but I definitely deserve what comes next." She walked out of the facility on her own 2 feet, through the front doors, into the Arizona sunshine. Margaret walked beside her, not touching, not pushing, just present. "I do not understand any of this," Sarah said. "I know." Margaret's voice was gentle. "We have time. We have all the time you need." Sarah looked back at the facility one more time. Through the glass doors, she could see Marcus being led away in handcuffs. He was still shouting, still threatening. No one was listening anymore. The next few days passed in a blur of revelations. Margaret told Sarah everything about Vincent Crawford, Sarah's biological father, a violent man from a Texas oil family. About the threats he made when Margaret tried to leave him. About Eleanor Walsh, Margaret's trusted housekeeper, who helped her escape with baby Sarah in the middle of the night. About the fire that was supposed to have killed them both. "Eleanor saved you," Margaret said. "She took you and she disappeared. She spent 32 years keeping you safe from your father and his family. She gave up her entire life to protect you." Sarah thought of Eleanor's calloused hands, her tired eyes, her constant watchfulness all those years, moving from town to town, never staying anywhere too long. Sarah had thought Eleanor was just restless. Now she understood it was strategy. She never told me, Sarah whispered. She was afraid. Vincent had connections everywhere. His brother Robert continued his work even after Vincent went to prison. If they had found you, they would have used you to hurt me, or worse. So she kept me hidden, kept me ignorant. She kept you alive. Margaret reached out hesitantly, then drew her hand back. I know this is a lot to process. I know you have every right to be angry. Sarah was not angry. She was too overwhelmed for anger. The woman who raised her had been a hero, a protector who sacrificed everything for a child that was not even hers by blood. Eleanor had been more of a mother than Sarah had ever understood. The safety deposit box, Sarah said. She told me to open it when I was ready. I know. Lisa Thompson found it. That is how my investigators connected everything. Margaret smiled sadly. Eleanor left you the truth. She trusted you to find it when you needed it. The box had contained Sarah's original birth certificate, naming her as Sarah Margaret Crawford. It contained photographs of Margaret holding baby Sarah, the same locket Sarah still wore visible in every picture. It contained legal documents establishing the Hartwell Family Trust, $40 million that Sarah had never known existed. And it contained a letter from Eleanor, written in her careful handwriting. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then you are ready to know who you are. Your mother is a good woman who loved you enough to let you go. I have loved you enough to keep you safe. Whatever happens next, remember that you are never alone. You are always protected. You are always loved. Now go and live the life you deserve. Sarah had read the letter 5 times. She still was not sure she believed any of it. What happens now? She asked Margaret. Whatever you want, Margaret replied. This is your life, Sarah. Your inheritance. Your choices. I am not here to control you. God knows you have had enough of that. And Marcus? In custody, charged with fraud, financial abuse, and conspiracy. His friend Dr. Harrison is facing his own charges. Margaret's expression hardened. He will not hurt you again. I will make certain of that. Sarah placed her hands on her belly. The baby had been quiet for the past few days, as if she too was processing everything that had happened. I do not know how to be your daughter, Sarah said honestly. I do not know how to be an heiress, or a Hartwell, or any of this. I am just Sarah, the woman Eleanor raised. My son? That is exactly who I want to know. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I lost you for 32 years. I do not need you to be anything other than who you are. I just want the chance to know you, if you will let me. Sarah considered the woman in front of her, a stranger who was also her mother, a billionaire who had spent 3 decades grieving a daughter she thought was dead, a woman who had marshaled attorneys and investigators and law enforcement to rescue someone she barely knew, simply because blood demanded it. We can try, Sarah said finally, slowly. Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes. Slowly is perfect. 3 days later, Sarah went into labor. The labor lasted 14 hours. Sarah had imagined this moment many times during her pregnancy, but nothing had prepared her for the reality. The pain was immense, wave after wave that seemed to have no end. The fear was worse. Fear for the baby. Fear of complications. Fear that something would go wrong after everything she had survived. Margaret stayed with her the entire time. She held Sarah's hand through the contractions. She wiped the sweat from her forehead. She said nothing about being her mother, or the inheritance, or any of the complicated truths hanging between them. She was simply present, a steady anchor in a storm. At hour 12, something went wrong. Sarah's blood pressure spiked. The baby's heart rate dropped. Doctors rushed in, their faces tense, their voices rapid and urgent. Someone mentioned emergency cesarean. Someone else said there was no time. Sarah felt herself fading, the edges of her vision going dark, her body giving out after everything it had endured. In that moment, she saw Eleanor. Not a ghost, not literally, but there somehow, in the space between consciousness and oblivion, Eleanor was there. Her worn hands, her tired eyes, her voice, calm and certain. "I told you," Eleanor said, "when you were strong enough to handle it. You are strong now. You were always strong. I just helped you survive until you could see it." "I am scared," Sarah whispered. "Good. That means you have something worth living for." Then the darkness receded, and Sarah was back in the hospital room, and a baby was crying. Her baby, her daughter. The doctors were smiling. The nurses were smiling. Someone was saying that it had been close, but mother and baby were both stable. Sarah reached out with trembling hands and took her daughter for the first time. A small, perfect, furious bundle of life, screaming at the indignity of being born. "Hello?" Sarah whispered. "I am your mother. I have been waiting for you." Margaret stood at a distance, giving them space. Her face wet with tears. "She is beautiful," Margaret said. "She is angry." Sarah laughed through her own tears. "She gets that from me." They named her Eleanor Margaret. Eleanor for the woman who had sacrificed everything. Margaret for the woman who had never stopped searching. Sarah would file to change the last name to Crawford later, reclaiming the birth name that had been hidden from her for so long. But for now, in this moment, names did not matter. What mattered was that they were alive, both of them, against all odds. What mattered was that the nightmare was over. 6 months later, Marcus Mitchell stood trial. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the press gallery. Curious onlookers lined the benches. The case had attracted national attention, a story of abuse and manipulation and hidden identity that seemed too dramatic to be true. Sarah sat in the witness stand and told her story. She did not cry. She did not waver. She spoke with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment, not the words, but the courage. She described the dog kennel, the financial control, the psychiatric commitment, the spyware on her phone, the methodical dismantling of her support system over 4 years of marriage. She showed the jury the locket, explained the hidden engraving that had led to her identification. She showed them bank records proving Marcus had researched her identity before they ever met. She showed them the safety deposit box that Eleanor had prepared, the truth hidden away until Sarah was ready to find it. "He did not marry me because he loved me," Sarah said. "He married me because I was worth $40 million and I did not know it. He kept me isolated so I would never find out. And when I started asking questions, he tried to take my sanity, my child, and my future." She paused, looking directly at Marcus for the first time since taking the stand. "I am here to take them back." Marcus's lawyers tried everything. They claimed Sarah was unstable. They claimed she had seduced him for money. They claimed the entire case was a conspiracy orchestrated by the Hartwell family. None of it worked. The evidence was overwhelming. The paper trail Marcus had left, in his arrogance, was a mile long. Dr. Harrison had already lost his medical license and was facing his own charges. Every lie Marcus told was contradicted by documentation he had never expected anyone to find. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, Marcus was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. As he was led from the courtroom, he looked at Sarah with pure hatred. The mask finally dropped, the charming husband revealed as the monster he had always been. Sarah's response was simple. She smiled. She waved. Then she picked up her daughter and walked out of the courtroom into the Arizona sunshine. Outside, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. Questions flew from every direction. One journalist pushed closer than the others. Mrs. Crawford, what would you say to women who are in similar situations? Sarah paused. She thought of herself 2 years ago, trapped and isolated and convinced she was losing her mind. She thought of all the women watching this story unfold, women who might be living their own versions of it right now. Leave, she said, looking directly into the camera. Not when it is safe, because it will never feel safe. Leave when you know. You know, you know when someone is hurting you. You know when it is wrong. Trust yourself. Get out, and then rebuild. She turned and walked to the waiting car, where Margaret sat, with baby Eleanor in her lap. That was brave, Margaret said. That was necessary. Sarah took her daughter and held her close. Someone has to say it. 2 years later, the Walsh Foundation opened its doors. Named after Eleanor, funded by Sarah's inheritance, it provided legal assistance, financial education, and safe housing for survivors of financial abuse. Sarah ran it personally, reviewing cases, meeting with clients, speaking at conferences about the patterns she had learned to recognize too late. Her book, The Dog Shed, became a bestseller, not because of the sensational story, but because of the practical guidance woven throughout: how to document abuse, how to build a support network an abuser does not control, how to recognize the warning signs before it is too late. Margaret and Sarah built a real relationship, not without conflict, not without the grief of lost years, but real. Margaret learned not to push. Sarah learned to let herself be supported. They found a balance that honored both their needs. Eleanor, now 2 years old, was walking, talking, and causing chaos everywhere she went. Her first word was no, spoken with conviction that made both Sarah and Margaret laugh. She is definitely an O'Brien, Margaret said. She will run the world or burn it down, Sarah replied. Either way, I am proud. On a quiet evening in October, Sarah sat on the porch of her new home, watching Eleanor chase fireflies in the yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was cool and sweet. She thought of the dog kennel. Not with terror anymore, but with distance. That place did not define her. That man did not own her. The victim she had been was gone, replaced by someone stronger. Thank you, Mom, she whispered to the twilight, to Eleanor Walsh, wherever she was, to the woman who had given up everything to keep her safe. She picked up her phone to check her messages and froze. One new voicemail, unknown number. She pressed play, breathing, then a voice, distorted but familiar. Did you think it was over? Did you really think prison walls could hold me? Sarah's blood turned to ice. I am out on appeal. Technical error. The case was thrown out, and I am coming for what is mine. The line went dead. Sarah sat very still for a long moment, her heart pounding. The old fear tried to rise, tried to drag her back to the helpless woman she had been. But she was not that woman anymore. She walked into the house, opened a drawer in her home office, and pulled out a folder. Inside were contingency plans, new identities prepared, escape routes mapped, evidence backups stored in multiple locations. She had learned from her mistakes. She would never be caught unprepared again. She picked up her phone and dialed Margaret's number. He is out, Sarah said calmly. We need to activate the protocol. I will have the team assembled within the hour. Sarah ended the call and walked back outside. Eleanor was still chasing fireflies, laughing at each one she almost caught. Come here, sweetheart, Sarah said, scooping up her daughter. Mommy has some phone calls to make. She looked out into the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, Marcus thought he was hunting her. He thought she was the same frightened woman he had locked in a dog kennel 3 years ago. He was wrong. This time, she was ready. This time, she had resources, allies, and the hardened determination of a woman who had survived the worst and refused to go back. The prey had become the predator, and Marcus Mitchell had no idea what was coming for him. If you believe stories like this matter, if you think someone you know needs to hear this message, share this video with them. A single share could reach the one person who needs it most tonight. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. I read every single comment, and your words help others feel less alone. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. We tell stories of survival, justice, and women who refuse to stay silent. New stories every week. Now, let us begin. Closing statement. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team. Every story we tell is crafted with intention, designed not just to entertain, but to educate, empower, and remind you that no matter how dark your chapter may be, it is never the end of your story. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of this community. We will see you in the next one.